Hello and welcome to another episode of Useless Information. My name is Daryl Woods and I'm not down in the lower left-hand corner because I've got some new software that I'm working with today. But I do work at Hollywood St. Paul's in Adult Services. And today, before I tell you what our topic is, I'd like you to see if you can possibly guess who it is based on the picture at the top. My guess is most of you cannot, even though he was our 14th President of the United States. Well, I am talking about Franklin Pierce, and today we're going to be talking about his unlikely rise to the presidency. So Franklin Pierce was a former senator and former representative. He had not held an actual political position for several years, although he was kind of in the background of the political scene in New Hampshire when the 1852 Democratic National Convention came around. He decided that he was going to go. But before he left, his wife, Jane, made him promise that he would not run for president. Now, she was half joking because there were a lot of candidates. There were roughly 24 candidates, and so it was kind of like everybody's running, so sure, why wouldn't he run too? But she was also pretty serious. She had lived in Washington, D.C. before when her husband was a senator and congressman, and she didn't like the area. She liked her own home quite a bit better. She just kind of disliked politics in general, and even more so, she disliked the personality that was brought out in her husband when he was involved in politics. But nonetheless, Franklin did make this promise. Don't worry, honey, I'm not going to run for president. And so off he went. So now, how does a guy who has absolutely no interest in running for president end up winning the Democratic nomination? So that's what we're going to get into. So first off, there's no way that he would have thought that he had a chance at becoming president because there were four really formidable players involved. The front runner heading into the convention was Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass was from Michigan, and he had won the nomination of the Democratic Party for president in 1948 and had lost the general election. Lewis Cass also supported popular sovereignty. That means when a new state comes into existence, when it joins the Union, that the people then get to decide whether they are going to be a slave state or a free state. Another big name that was in this battle was James Buchanan. James Buchanan was from Pennsylvania. He was the former Secretary of State under Polk and Taylor. He was a former Federalist, and he supported the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, the Fugitive Slave Law dictated that if a slave ran away and reached a free state, that he could still be pursued by his owner and returned to the plantation to be enslaved once again. Now, obviously, Buchanan was a powerhouse. The guy ended up winning the nominee of the Democratic Party 4 years later and ended up being our 15th president. Then there was Stephen Douglas, who's a name that I'm sure you've heard of, famous for the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So he actually secured the Democratic nomination 8 years later. He was from Illinois, just like Lincoln. And he was the spearhead behind the Compromise of 1850, which was mostly written by William Clay. And this compromise was rather unpopular in both the North and the South. One thing is it expanded the fugitive slave law, making it much easier for a slave owner to go after a former slave. And it also held popular sovereignty. So neither side was really crazy about that compromise. Then you got William L. Marcy. He was a New Yorker. He was the former Secretary of War under Polk. Now, there was a time when the next president was almost always the previous Secretary of War, much more frequently than the former Vice President or the Secretary of State. The Secretary of War was really considered the stepping stone to the presidency. So you've got these four powerhouses and about 20 other people who are all running for nomination, and so you can see how it would be difficult to nail down 2/3 majority that was required for nomination. In fact, it was so difficult that after 34 ballots, the only result they had found was that people were getting more and more upset and frustrated with the results. So after the 34th ballot, there were some supporters from New Hampshire who suggested, let's throw in yet another name and let's see what happens. Maybe this will draw some support away from the weaker candidates and therefore strengthen the stronger candidates. That was the belief anyway. So in the beginning, Cass had a ton of support. In fact, the first 19 ballots, he was the winner, but not the 2/3 majority winner. And then after 19 ballots, his popularity dwindled to where he got dipped as low as third, and then he rebounded to where he was back in the lead. Once again, never with a 2/3 majority, though. Buchanan was mostly in second place throughout, although he did lead about 10 different ballots. William Marcy had a lot of third and fourth place finishes, although there were a few that he was the leader on, the 45th through 48th. And Stephen Douglas, he did lead a couple. He was second in quite a few, but another guy who was mostly third and fourth. Then you got Franklin Pierce. So Pierce was relatively anonymous. Even though he'd been a senator, had been a congressman, most people really weren't all that familiar with him or where he stood on the issues, which ended up being a good thing because while everybody else was fighting about where they stood on slavery, Pierce was able to kind of sneak in under the radar. He was a handsome guy. He was very sociable, well-spoken. He was a war veteran, so that spoke well of him. He also had a very good bloodline. Franklin Pierce could trace his roots back to Henry IV of England, Henry I of England, back to William the Conqueror, and even back to Rollo the Viking. So that stood in his favor as well. He was a former congressman and senator, so he had the experience. He was well-liked by both parties, and he was both well-liked in both the North and the South. He was not too forceful, which ended up being a real positive, especially when it came to the issue of slavery, which was quite contentious. And by the time the 49th ballot came around, he was the near unanimous winner. And here's a little visual representation. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, red is Franklin Pierce, and he's not involved in any of those early ballots, and then he's kind of holding steady for a few, and then he gains a little bit more traction, and then all of a sudden, everybody throws their weight behind Franklin Pierce. So now, he's going up against the competing party in the presidential election was the Whigs. Remember, the Republican Party did not have a candidate for president until Abraham Lincoln. So the Whigs had a standing president. Millard Fillmore was the president. But the Whigs decided there was no way that he was going to get reelected because of his stance on the Compromise of 1850, that he was the one that really pushed that through. So they said, okay, we got to find somebody else. So what they decided to do was kind of react to Pierce's nomination, and they said, well, let's bring in Pierce as commander. So they brought in General Winfield Scott. And that might have worked if it wasn't for Winfield Scott's personality. He ignored political advice and decided he was going to come right out in support of the Compromise of 1850, the very thing that the Whigs said that Millard Fillmore could not get reelected because of. So heading into the general election, neither candidate really wanted to debate policy, and so they mostly resorted to mudslinging. During the U.S.-Mexican War, Franklin Pierce took a grave wound to his leg and he ended up passing out due to the pain. And so he ended up getting the nickname Fainting Frank. And so Scott used to throw this around quite a bit, referring to him as Fainting Frank, trying to downplay his role in the war. For his part, Pierce really didn't actively campaign very much, and his public appearances were limited, which turned out to be a good strategy because Scott came off as egotistical and mean, and therefore Pierce won handily. So now we're heading into the inauguration, and 2 months before Inauguration Day, the Pierce family is in a terrible train wreck that claimed the life of their only surviving child. Poor Franklin and Jane actually witnessed the death of their child, and that had a lasting stain on their attitude towards taking over the presidency. Remember, Jane didn't want to be in the White House, period. She was a cold and cheerless first lady who didn't even come to Washington, D.C. for almost a year. Franklin, who already had a bit of a problem with alcoholism, continued and perhaps worsened his alcoholism, if you can believe it. He was actually arrested for drunk driving during his presidency when he struck a female pedestrian in Washington, D.C. Can you imagine the blowback if something like that happened today? And very little got accomplished in his presidency. He was mired in depression and really wasn't interested in doing the job. And so even though he had strong majorities in both the House and the Senate, not much happened. So Pierce himself was mildly anti-slavery, but he allowed himself to be pushed around by pro-slavery Democrats, which then created the impression that he himself was pro-slavery. And I guess if you're not willing to stand for a conviction, how much of a conviction is it really? His ineffective leadership and the collapse of the Whig Party then led to the birth and emergence of the Republican Party, but it also brought us closer to civil war. Pierce became the first and only elected president to not be re-nominated by his party as an incumbent. Now, you might be thinking that I just mentioned how Millard Fillmore was an incumbent who wasn't re-nominated by his party, which is true, but Fillmore wasn't elected to presidency. He assumed the presidency. And on Franklin's death, the New York Herald had this to say about Franklin Pierce. They said, deceased was a man of something more than average ability. He possessed, however, none of the attributes of greatness, and was more of a cautious, studious, and watchful politician than a comprehensive, far-seeing, or observant statesman. And this kind of makes me sad a little bit, I guess. I kind of told you about the lineage of Franklin Pierce. He himself had a bit of a lineage. So one of his great-great-grandnieces or something to that effect, great-great-niece I guess it would be, was Barbara Bush. And so Jeb and W are both his descendants. And interestingly enough, I am also one of his descendants. My grandmother was cousins to Barbara Bush. Okay, so anyway, I do want to give a special thanks to Maya, who puts together these wonderful slides and adorns them with these gorgeous pictures. She does a great job for us every single week. And I also like to thank these resources that I got much of my information from. And if you enjoyed this, and I hope that you did, I think you'll also enjoy our virtual trivia night. It happens every Thursday at 8 p.m. on Facebook. You can go to this URL, or you can just go to Facebook and type in virtual trivia night, and you should find us. It's a lot of fun every week. And so this has been Useless Information. I would love to hear your comments, your suggestions, your questions, your corrections. If you have them, you can send them to the email address that you see here, or you can just leave a comment down below, and I will definitely see it and provide you with some sort of reaction, which will be positive. I do appreciate the comments that you provide, and so Until next week, thank you very much.